It is an honor to be here. I wish I was on campus with you. I wish we could share some time together, but we need to be safe in these difficult times. We need to be wise in these difficult times. We need to be discerning in these difficult times. I'm delighted to be here. Let me just jump into this because I want to make sure we have enough time to talk, to dialogue. We gather this evening, the day after the inauguration of the 46th President of the United States. Many of us, I suspect, breathe a sigh of relief. As my great grandmother, Ruby Wilson, would say, I'm glad to see the back of Donald Trump's head. You know, the run up to this moment revealed how fragile American democracy is. We've experienced so much over these last 4 years. But January 6th made it clear that there are those among us who are committed to the idea that this country must remain a white nation and that only white voters, white votes matter, and that they are willing to sack the Capitol and threaten the lives of the leadership of this nation in defense of that view. We saw clearly how some believe that they possess a different quality of citizenship than others. I'm reminded of how the police responded to the peaceful protest by many of the Black Lives Matter young folk during this past summer. Now, mind you, some of those protests turned violent, but I'm thinking about the peaceful marches and how they confronted a militarized police and tear gas and rubber bullets, police officers and bullhorns telling them to disperse. And I'm comparing that. I compare that in my mind to how the Capitol Police responded to many of the protesters on January 6th. How some took selfies and others, how could I say? There's one image of one police officer literally helping a woman who had stormed the Capitol as she was walking out with the others, helping her walk down the steps. In some ways, this group who believe that they possess a different quality of citizenship than others, that they believe that they have a right to dissent, that America is their possession. And the rest of us simply need to be grateful and shut up. Think about the reaction to Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and how that act was a desecration of the flag. And think about the way in which, the gentle way in which people are in some ways responding to or have responded to the insurrectionists. What we saw on January 6th was the culmination, I believe, of a conservative backlash to the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. For well over 40 years, we have been living, I believe, in that reaction. As some railed against big government and so-called entitlement programs, and others built the carceral state that has resulted in the incarceration of millions of Americans, mostly Black and brown. We have witnessed over these 40 years or so the evisceration of a robust conception of the public good because we have been transformed from citizens into simply self-interested persons in pursuit of our own aims and ends in competition and rivalry with others. So much so that for some among us, liberty has become a synonym for selfishness. We see those among us who even refuse to wear a mask to protect their fellows. They even make the claim that a national strategy to respond to the devastation of COVID-19 amounts to the tyranny of government. In this context, I believe, communal life has given way to gated communities and communities of hyper-concentrated poverty. We've seen over the course of these 40 years or so, the flatlining of wages for working people, the skyrocketing of student loan debt, the increased precarity for working people as the rich has continued to extract resources while the rest have struggled to keep their noses above water. This, to my mind, was the reaction to the demand for a more racially just America, the dismantling of the Great Society and a wholesale attack on the very framework of the New Deal. Our politics today have been overdetermined by the terrors and panic of the so-called forgotten American, a panic rooted in the unsettling sense that the whiteness of this country was and is under siege. What we saw on the steps of the Capitol were those Americans in full revolt in the face of the prospect that their world is dying. It was a white rebellion in the name of the belief that only white voters matter. Now, January 6th has to be juxtaposed to what happened yesterday. And what we saw and heard was in some ways the promise of a truly multiracial democracy, but we can't trade one fantasy for another. We have some difficult days ahead. I was heartened to hear the words from President Biden that disagreement must not lead to disunion. I was heartened to hear him talk that the dream of justice for all will no longer be deferred. It made my heart leap when I heard him use the language of white supremacy and racism. And when he talked about the fact that many people among us have been using lies for profit and for power. It brightened my spirit to see Kamala Harris sworn in as the next Vice President of the United States. I was overjoyed to hear the poetry of Amanda Gorman. It was what I take to be an extraordinary expression of the power of our tradition, of the visionary nature of our understanding of democracy. But we can't get ahead of our skis, as it were. We have some difficult days ahead. January 6th haunts. We saw in that mob white evangelicals, among them praying for the nation and praying for those who stormed the Capitol in the name of their so-called patriotism. And it has been, I think, one of the distinctive features of the last 40 years, that white evangelicalism and the smattering of color that has joined with them has forged such a close relationship with an ideological position that assumes implicitly, at least, that this nation must remain one where white people matter more than others. I'm reminded of a passage in James Baldwin's powerful essay, To Crush a Serpent, published in January of 1987. Quote, race and religion, it has been remarked, are fearfully entangled in the guts of this nation, so profoundly that to speak of the one is to conjure up the other. One cannot speak of sin without referring to Blackness, Baldwin writes, and Blackness stalks our history and our streets. Therefore, in many ways, perhaps in the deepest ways, the minister and the sheriff were hired by the Republic to keep the Republic white, to keep it from sin. But sin is no respecter of skin. Sin stains the soul, Baldwin writes. Therefore, again and again, the Republic is convulsed with the need for exorcism. Sin has not only come to town, but is in bed with us, end quote. Trumpism and the mob in its name on January 6th were the latest convulsions. Some may believe that yesterday was the latest effort at exorcism. We got some difficult days ahead. Now, my task this evening is to think a bit about the work of Black churches in responding to systemic racism against the backdrop of this latest convulsion and in light of the need for another so-called exorcism. With the Biden-Harris administration now in office, some believe we now have a chance to do the necessary work to change the direction of the country. And that may very well be true. But we face an enormous challenge. 900,000 Americans filed for unemployment this week. Black and brown people are dying disproportionately from COVID-19. Some predict that by the end of February, COVID-19 will have claimed over 500,000 of our fellows. And of that number, Black and brown people are disproportionately impacted by the disruption, the dislocation, and the death unleashed by the virus. All the while, we are still dying at the hands of the police. In fact, the nation is in the grips of a global pandemic and the ongoing pandemic of racism. We still have the fact that 74, we still have the fact, and I want to emphasize this, we still have the fact that 74 million people still voted for Donald Trump, despite the evidence of the last 4 years, and that a large number among them refuse to believe that he actually lost the election. So even though we can think about the promise of yesterday, to echo Dr. King again, we've got some difficult days ahead. Now, what will be the response of Black churches in these times? Will they respond adequately to the racial reckoning we face as a country? Are they responding adequately to this racial reckoning? These are questions that echo, at least for me, something I struggled with some 10 years ago. Now, can you imagine? 11 years ago, I published this text. For the launching of the religion page of the Huffington Post, I wrote what has since become a kind of controversial piece entitled "The Black Church is Dead." I had just finished reading Ralph Waldo Emerson's Divinity School address at the time, and I felt inspired at that moment to challenge not only the historiography around Black churches, but also to provoke a conversation about the work of this venerable institution in fighting on behalf of the least of these. Most readers were caught off guard by the title, "The Black Church is Dead." Clickbait, can be a dangerous thing. Some may have read the title and decided that they had the gist of the argument. Others tend to assimilate the claims of that short piece into a long lineage of criticisms of the Black church. For example, my fellow Morehouse man and now U.S. Senator for the state of Georgia, Raphael Warnock, in his book, The Divided Church, likened my account to the previous work of the Black church, work on the Black church, that of W.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and Benjamin Eliza Mays and E. Franklin Frazier. And these folk, in some ways, kind of engaged in this ongoing criticism of the failure of the church in some ways to respond to the actual needs of Black communities. There was this kind of insistence on the prophetic, progressive understanding of the church. But as Warnock put it, Eddie Glaude, quote, represented this classic genre of scholarship, recapitulating some old themes in a new era when, which created a storm of controversy by declaring that the Black church is dead. Ironically, Warnock goes on to write, he goes on to say both the exacerbated and hyperbolic character of this assertion and the ensuing conversation and controversy it created on all sides of the debate bespeak the enduring significance of the institution in question. Warnock writes, if the Black church is dead, as Glaude asserts, concern over its prospects for resuscitation and role as an instrument of liberation is very much alive, end quote. What's fascinating here, and Dr. Warnock stands in for a general criticism of the piece that I wrote 10 years ago, is that the only part of my argument that is even assimilable to that of the scholars listed, that of Du Bois and Woodson and Mays and Frazier, right, isn't even mentioned by Warnock. my concern about the differentiation of Black communities that I'll get to a bit later. Instead, its focus remains on the title of the piece, The Black Church is Dead. Now, my argument then and now centered on a basic historiographical claim that the stories we've told about Black churches often downplay how politically complicated these spaces are. I know every preacher in this audience just nodded their heads. Huh? That the stories we've told about Black churches often downplay how politically complicated these spaces are. The debate over whether the church, and I use this phrase advisedly, the church, the debate over whether the church has a priestly or prophetic function often trades on a set of assumptions that a kind of progressive politics inheres in the institution itself. That Black churches stand as these unique institutional spaces in Black life, spaces that can be traced back to the hush harbors and denominations that refuse to submit to the degrading experience of white churches, like the extraordinary denomination of African Methodist Episcopal churches. There is something inherently radical, right? For example, in Howard Thurman's claim that the slave dared to redeem the religion profaned in its midst, or that the very idea that Black Christianity is a refutation of the idolatry of white Christianity. There's a story that we tell because of the kind of beginnings of Black Christendom in the United States that downplay in some ways how politically vexed these spaces are. That we want to read them as by definition progressive, as by definition prophetic, precisely because we understand the context out of which they come. Now, what I insisted upon 10 years ago, and what I still maintain now, is that Black churches have always been complicated spaces, especially politically, not in terms of the internal politics of the church, right? What you have to do in order to manage deacon boards, what you have to do in order to manage, the politics of the ecclesia. I'm not talking about that politics. I'm talking about the very ways in which the church responds, right, to the political realities that shapes the life chances, right, of the people who inhabit the church. The very context, social, political, and economic context in which the church has to engage its ministry. How it responds to the world has always been a complicated affair. In the context of slavery, not everyone interpreted the gospel like Nat Turner, you know that. Du Bois even noted in Souls of Black Folk in the chapter of the Faith of the Fathers that churches were differentiated. As he wrote in Souls, quote, between the two extreme types of ethical attitude, which I have thus sought to make clear, wavers the mass of the millions of Negroes, North and South, and their religious life and activity partake of this social conflict within their ranks. Du Bois says their churches are differentiating. This is in 1903, and he actually wrote the piece a few years earlier. Their churches are differentiating, he said, now into groups of cold, fashionable devotees, in no way distinguishable from certain white groups save in color of skin, now into large social and business institutions, catering to the desire for information and amusement of their members, warily avoiding unpleasant questions both within and without the Black world, and preaching in effect, if not word, dum vivamus, while we live, let us live, yes? So even in 1903, in the Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois is trying to mark how these churches are differentiating, how some look no different, act no differently from white churches, and how others are really concerned with a broader set of issues that don't necessarily address the political circumstances of Black folk. Now, we could read this passage normatively or descriptively, right? That is, this differentiation can represent a decline or it can just simply be a description of what obtains in the world. I tend towards the latter, that it's just a description of the complex landscape in which, right, Black churches exist. That you have some that are social and business like, to use Du Bois's language, that you have some that are not easily differentiated from white churches, that you have some that are this and that and this and that. It's the complex, array of Black religious expression that defines Black Christendom, as it were. All too often, though, the phrase the Black church carries with it a certain set of assumptions about the political role of the institution, assumptions that that role is necessarily a prophetic or progressive one. So this idea of it being a decline presumes that the church has fallen away from its mission, as it were. What I was trying to say over 10 years ago, and what I'm saying now, is that that is not necessarily the case. Black churches are not necessarily prophetic or necessarily progressive. We have conservative churches, we have conservative ministers, we have proponents of a prosperity gospel in some places, who may not echo Du Bois's claim exactly of while we live, let us live, but they will talk about sowing a seed and what ought to follow from that fact. They are proponents of a gospel that actually fits perfectly with the political economy of the last 40 years. Part of what I was trying to do was to disrupt what the phrase actually obscures, what the phrase the Black church keeps or hides from view. And I think what it hides from view is the inherent complexity of Black life and the ongoing need for us to actually do politics. Y'all didn't hear me. Let me say it again. Oftentimes, the Black church as a phrase actually obscures the inherent complexity of Black life and the ongoing need for us to actually do politics. There's often this assumption that by the very fact that we are Black, we ought to hold the same positions. As if it's the case that the fact of our Blackness should align our aspirations, should align our interests, should make us one homogeneous blob where all of us are moving toward the same ends and the same goals. And what we know is that Black folk are not monolithic. You got some folk who are happy that Donald Trump cut their taxes. Y'all didn't hear me. You got some folk out here who are not just simply wearing MAGA hats, but who are invested in an economic system that presupposes the disposability of Black people, the disposability of people who in other words, make profits possible. They are invested in the status quo, and what they're arguing for are openings so that they themselves can assume the reins of power. Baldwin was writing about this in 1987 when he wrote The Evidence of Things Not Seen, a book about the Atlanta child murders. And he was saying, oh, we got some difficult days ahead. What do we do with all of these Black babies dying and Black people hold the reins of power? What do we do when white supremacy obtains and Black people hold the reins of power? How do you make sense of Baltimore on fire and President Obama calling them thugs? How do you make sense of these moments where the complexity of Black life is made known? Oftentimes, there's a sense in which Black folk are thought of as pre-political. You see, it's another way of rendering us as primitive in some ways. That the fact of our Blackness constitutes our politics, as if we don't have self-interested persons, as if we don't have occasion to grapple with the reality of capitalists or the reality of patriarchal people who are proponents of patriarchy or sexism, that we have to engage in critique around heteronormative assumptions about who we are, right? As if we don't have to deal with all of the differences that comprise who we are, which necessitate that we do politics. We just assume that by definition, those who inhabit Black churches are progressive. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? So the first part of the argument I was making 10 years ago was that we have to tell a more complex story about Black churches. That they're not just, citadels for progressive or prophetic politics. Or it's not just this progressive or prophetic institution, that this priestly and prophetic dichotomy actually obscures what's happening on the ground more than it illuminates. The second point in that piece echoes what I've just been talking about. The second point in the piece is that most people ignore the gesture toward this complexity. And I wanted us to see that Black communities, not just simply Black churches, but Black communities are more complex and differentiated than the standard story about the church, than what the standard story suggests. Communities are differentiated. It's not as if the church house is the center of community, especially when a lot of you lock your doors after Wednesday and Sunday. It's not as if these churches are at the center of the community anymore, when many of them are moving out into the suburbs as they've built these enormous campuses, and we've lost in some ways the community church. And if the church still is in the community in which it began, many of the people drive from the suburbs into the community to go to church, and then they leave it to go back home. That's what the data suggests, right? Communities are differentiated. One has to ask the question, who's more influential in this day? The local pastor or Jay-Z or Oprah? Who's more influential today? What's more influential today? Sunday service or TikTok? There is this differentiation that complicates how we think about the role and significance of church. Who's attending, who's not attending, as Dr. Brisbane, as she invoked in her introductory remarks. And it's all the more true, I think, today, as we see millennials and Gen Zers who are moving every 5 to 7 years. You invest all this money in building brick and mortar, and your community is constantly circulating, constantly changing and shifting. We have to ask the question, what does it mean to do church in 2021? And oh my God, COVID-19 has brought that home in a different sort of way, as most of us have had to migrate online, right? And try to figure out how to do church in this moment. Brick and mortar aren't as important as they once were. But again, our story tends to gloss over that complexity and merely asserts the ongoing importance of the institution. I was interested in those spaces and people that competed for influence, and particularly asking about all of those who were unchurched, all of those who didn't fall within the orbit of this extraordinary institution. So the first point I made 10 years ago, I still want to make, right? That we need to complicate our story of Black churches. The second point that I made 10 years ago, I still want to make, that we need to complicate our understanding of Black communities, that our community has become even more differentiated as, in some ways, we've broken barriers, as some of us have entered into mainstream society in clearer ways, as some of us have in some ways acquired the reins of power, as there have become class differentiation, as internal differences have made themselves known, whether they're ethnic differences, whether they're racial and sexual, whether they're sexual differences in terms of sexuality, gender differences, all of those things impact how we live our lives as Black folk. And we have to do politics. We just can't assume that the fact of Blackness will determine the outcome of our political positions. And this led to the last point that I made 10 years ago that I want to make today. And that is the routinization. I know I'm going to take too much time. I wish I could see you, because then we could go for it for real, for real. And that is the routinization of Black prophetic witness. We need to tell a more complex story of Black churches. We need to tell a more complex story of Black communities. And we need to confront how those simple stories lead to the routinization of Black prophetic witness. I wrote 10 years ago this passage. Too often, the prophetic energies of Black churches are represented as something inherent to the institution. And we need only point to past deeds for evidence of this fact. Sentences like the Black church has always stood for. The Black church was our rock. Without the Black church, we would not have ... In each instance, a backward glance defines the content of the church's stance in the present, justifying its continued relevance and authorizing its voice. Its task, because it has become alienated from the moment in which it lives, is to make us venerate and conform to it. But such a church loses its power. Memory becomes its currency, and its soul withers from neglect. The result is all too often church services and liturgies that entertain but lack a spirit that transforms, and preachers who deign for followers instead of fellow travelers in God. Y'all didn't hear me. Preachers who deign for followers instead of fellow travelers in God. Now, obviously, I have a politics, it's clear. And I'm trying to decenter certain assumptions about the church as such, and calling Black churches in particular to a different kind of politics. I want to insist on a living, breathing, and active prophetic witness, not just an assertion of what we've done. I want a prophetic witness that emerges out of what we're doing. I don't want just simply somebody giving me a litany of what has been done in the past, telling me about what march you have participated in, telling me about what church house, what meeting. I want to know what you're doing in the current moment to speak to the devastation that is confronting our community in this moment. What I wrote then, I still believe. Prophetic energies are not an inherent part of Black churches. In here in the church itself, but rather in instances of men and women who grasp the fullness of meaning to be one with God. And this can't be passed down, but must be embraced in the moment in which one finds one's feet. And this ensures that prophetic energies can be expressed again and again and again. So what I was declaring dead 10 years ago was not Black churches themselves, but the idea of the Black church. I wanted to liberate us from a category that all too often flattens our history, rushes over our complexity, and assumes what it ought not to assume. I wanted us to look at what was actually happening on the ground and to do the work of God in real time, in our moment. And plus, with my tongue in cheek, I knew I had already glimpsed that although my detractors didn't mention, when is it for the Christian that death has the last word? When is it the case that death has the last word? Especially for the Black Christian, death never has the last word. In fact, death is the occasion for resurrection. But that's another point that we want to make. Sometimes we you got these resurrection Christians, What do I mean by that? You know, during Holy Week, they want to run past Saturday and get to Sunday. I'm more interested in the Saturday Christian. Y'all get me? Y'all understand what I'm talking about here? Right? So people want to run to the light, the promise of resurrection, but they don't want to deal with the meaning and depth of the darkness of Saturday when we don't know if God's going to get up. In the end, I can go on about that. We can talk about that later. In the end, awakening the church is really about awakening those who inhabit the church. Y'all hear me? Awakening the church is really about awakening those who inhabit the church. It is about doing the work of politics informed by the ministry of Jesus. If churches are to respond to systemic racism, it must entail congregations demanding to hear a prophetic word from their pulpits, to have active ministries that impact the lives of their members and the communities within which they live. We are the church. We are the church. So we must respond with boldness and conviction to the reality of racism in our lives. This isn't about what the Black church is or isn't. It is about us. Awakening the church means awakening you, awakening me, awakening us to live the gospel. It has always been about us and what we are willing to do in the name of that man who gave his life on the cross. It's always been about us and what we are willing to do in the name of that man who gave his life on the cross. Everybody should be looking at you and they should be saying to themselves, they must be drunk. You have to be maladjusted to the injustice in this world. Awakening the church means awakening you and me. Let me return to the Baldwin essay by way of closing. Y'all all right? Y'all all right? I hope so. I want to return to Crush a Serpent. It is a stunning piece in its criticism of the conservative moral majority and the way Baldwin handles his own pain and anguish, the pain and anguish he experienced within the walls of his own church. But Jimmy's words about salvation stand out to me in these dark times. And I want to read them to you if you don't mind. Quote, salvation is not flight from the wrath of God. It is accepting and reciprocating the love of God. Salvation is not separation. It is the beginning of union with all that is or has been or will ever be. There's absolutely no salvation, Baldwin writes, without love. This is the will in the middle of the will. Salvation does not divide. Salvation connects so that one sees oneself in others and others in oneself. It is not the exclusive property of any dogma, creed, or church. It keeps the channel open between oneself and however one wishes to name that which is greater than oneself. For Baldwin, complexity is our only safety, and love is the only key to our maturity. Salvation is found in that extraordinary work of loving one's way to the tomb. With this in mind, we must awaken to the difficult days ahead. We must understand that this nation is at a crossroads, and there's no guarantee that it will survive. What will be the role of Black Christians in this moment? What will you fight for? How will you stand in this moment as Christians as we fight for a more just world? Churches, beyond the brick and mortar, are made up of you. If you are convicted by the cross, if you are called to live in what the blood means, what are you going to do? Awakening the church begins with us. And at its best, as Baldwin wrote, the minister and the flock, I'm talking to ministers now. Baldwin wrote, the minister and the flock mirror each other. It demands a very rare, intrepid, and genuinely free and loving shepherd to challenge the habits and fears and assumptions of his flock and help them enter into the freedom that enables us to move to higher ground, end quote. Who will you be, Pastor? Who will you be? What kind of leader will you be? We have enough sleepwalkers in churches across this land. We have enough court prophets who desire to walk the corridors of power in this land. We have too many fans in the pulpits and too many fans in the pews and too many celebrities in the pulpit. Who will you be? How will you bear witness to the blood of the cross in this time of storm and stress? Ours is an occasion for a new kind of sacrifice and a powerful enactment of love, a transformative exhibition of courage. Awaken and help bring about a more just world where all of God's children can be fully themselves. And remember what that 22-year-old baby said yesterday, Amanda Gorman. And I'll leave with these words. There's always a light if we're brave enough to see it. There's always a light if we're brave enough to see it. There's always a light if we're brave enough to be it. My Lord, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Glaude. We have, I'm sure, a few questions. I'm waiting for them to be passed along to me. But before we dive into those, I have a couple questions if I could pose them to you real quick.
Sure.
One is by point of clarification. You use the term "do politics," and I think you have a much more robust understanding of that than most people would have when they talk about politics. I think they have a very narrow notion. And so could you explain exactly what you mean about doing politics?
Right. So the first thing I don't simply mean engaging in the electoral process.
Right.
Right. Politics is being, do we support Democrats or Republicans or electing representative figures? That's part of my conception of politics, but it's not reducible to that. Mm-hmm. The way in which I think about politics it involves how do we as a community of fellows engage in the ongoing work to determine the distribution of resources that will allow us to live a life fully, to flourish together. And that extends from not only electing people, that extends to how we engage in civic life, what we're doing in our day-to-day interactions, whether it's coaching school, coaching football or soccer or baseball, basketball, a range of things, right? How do we impact in our doing, in our work together, the distribution of resources that will impact how we flourish or whether or not we flourish? That's what I mean by politics as a small p. In a democracy, Doc, voting is the last thing you do. This is really important. In a vibrant democracy, voting is the last thing you do. Politics happens well before that point. And we saw actually some of that in Georgia that led to the election of Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. They've been organizing for a long time before the election for that to happen.
Thank you. And now, having asked that question, it gives me, I want to follow up with that because I've noticed now a strain in your lecture or strand in your lecture is this notion of accepting the complexity of Black life.
Mhm.
And you say we have to do politics around that. And you say we have some difficult days ahead. Now, am I hearing you say that we got some very difficult conversations we have to have in our communities and with the larger American community?
Oh, absolutely. We can't just presume, President Brown, that uh, be, the fact of our blackness ought to evidence itself in jointly shared political aims and ends, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
some people who hold uh, what I might call a standard democratic politics. They are consistent with what the Democratic Party, the position of the Democratic Party for the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have some people who might want to make the argument that defunding the police, right, is a viable political position. And these other folk are saying, no, we can't invoke that, right? And they're going to be arguments had, and those arguments can't be quelled by some kind of practical assertion of this isn't good for Black people, right? We're going to have to work it out on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
right? And given the scale of problems we face as a community, unleashed by COVID-19, revealed by COVID-19, we're going to have some ambitious, bold, visionary responses. So I think we need to prepare ourselves for some contentious political arguments over the
Mm-hmm.
next few years.
And do you have a stake in those arguments?
I do. I do. I'm, as I wrote in Begin Again, I've gotten to a point in my life, Doc, where um, I've lost patience with trying to convince people to be otherwise. And
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that, I've lost patience in trying to convince my white fellows who hold insidious views about my value that they ought not to hold those views. I'm more interested in spending my energy in trying to build a new Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires a kind of vigorous assertion, right, of a vision of what that would look like. I think we need a new moral and social contract in this country. What are our obligations to each other? I don't think in the history of the richest country in the history of the world that you should go broke because you're sick.
Right.
I don't think in the richest country in the history of the world that every human being in this country should not have a decent roof over, have a roof over their heads and earn a living wage. I don't think it's important. I think it's important that we shift our conversation from law and order to safety and security, where defund the police is really about budgeting your values,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Who and what are you concerned about? I want to echo what Dr. King said in Where Do We Go From Here? The need for a revolution of value. So, I'm walking in lockstep with Bishop Barber,
Okay.
right? You see what
Mm-hmm.
I mean? So
Yeah.
that's what I said. I said in the talk, obviously I have a politics
Yes.
and I'm ready to fight about it. But I don't want us to assume that just because it's Black church, that there's a politics that necessarily is progressive that adheres there.
Mm-hmm.
That gets you in all kinds of trouble.
Yes. Well, now, and that brings up a good question that's come across several times in very different fashions. But I'm going to synthesize it down to this and say, what do you say to those people who really they hear what you say, but they don't hear it, right? And what I mean by that is, I'm still getting questions about how do we revive the Black church, and we're people hang on to that very very strongly, even though that was part of your a very much
Right,
big part of your argument that we
right,
got to let go of that notion. So
right.
how do we cast out that demon?
It's going to be very hard because it's a very romanticized conception of Black church, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that romanticized shorthand is doing a lot of work, right? And nostalgia is often a kind of nostalgic longing for the past, often is rooted in a desire to evade the failures of the present, an attempt to escape the now. So we reach for a nostalgic moment when, right? Um, as a way of clinging to the institution that means so much to us. And so part of the work that I'm trying to do is to say, look, let's step away from this ideal type of Black church and look at what Black churches are doing, right? And once
Mhm.
we turn our attention away from the Black church, right, as the model, as the ideal type, to what we're doing on the ground, and understand that the substance of what Black churches are doing are contingent upon us, what we're doing. Now we're in a totally different space. We actually are actors, are determining actors in the outcomes, not some inherent role of the Black church apart from what I'm doing. No, suddenly I take on responsibility. We take on responsibility, not just simply by walking through the doors, but by actually doing something, by living the witness within the structure of the church itself, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So it's hard to do, but we got to tell better stories. We got to
Yeah.
tell better stories. That's the first thing. We got to tell better stories.
Mhm.
I ask this question all the time to my students: who do you think won, Reverend Ike or Dr. King? And they go, oh, right?
Mhm.
And I'm like, no, it's a complicated, it's not an easy answer to make. It's not an easy answer to give when
Mhm.
you think about it, right? So,
That is
but it all depends on what we're doing. That's my short answer. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I want to get in one last question because it's a little different from the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from a Black pastor who pastors a predominantly white congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And he raises the question, how does he start a conversation, an honest conversation with them around the issue of race?
That's a wonderful question. And I think the way in which we do it is, I, and I'm thinking off the top of my head, but yesterday, President Biden invoked language that many of us are familiar with.
Mhm.
He said, to heal, we must remember. Remember that line? That was the day
Yeah,
before yesterday.
mhm.
To
Yeah, it's a
heal,
memorial, yes.
yeah, to heal, we must remember. Now, those of us who know about Passover, we understand what this means, right?
Mhm.
So part of remembering involves telling ourselves the truth about what we've done. So one of the ways in which we have this ministry around race is we have to confront the truth about the country, not in order to beat ourselves over the back with guilt, but to open up space for us to be otherwise. Because if we're lying to ourselves, there's no space for love. If we're lying to ourselves, there's no space for love and justice,
Mhm.
because we don't want to hold ourselves accountable, right? And part of that involves this ongoing quest for the illusion of innocence, right? So in order to heal, we have to remember. In order to remember, we got to tell the truth. And when we tell the truth, we make space for love to enter. And once love enters, now we can start talking about the work of justice. You
Mhm.
see, now we can, because Mike Dyson and Cornell are fond of saying, what does love look like? Justice is what love looks like in public.
Mm. Yes.
You see,
Yes.
but that's the way I think we can do it. Tell the truth,
Mhm.
open up space for love, and then that love becomes the precondition for doing the work of justice.